The power and presence of the Lord accompanied and followed me. Many wept exceedingly and cried out under the word, like persons that were hungering and thirsting for righteousness. And after I left them, God gave me to wrestle with him in my chamber, in behalf of some dear friends. Then present and others that were absent from us, the Spirit of the Lord was upon them all. It made intercessions with groanings that cannot be uttered. Welcome to the So We Speak podcast. This is Cole Fakes. I'm joined by Terry Fakes as usual and Cliff Sanders again for our series on the Great Awakening. These words taken from George Whitefield's journal in September of 1740 encompass almost everything there is to say about the Great Awakening. The power of the Spirit, the intercession, the preaching, the presence of the Lord. So we started this series talking about John Wesley and specifically how John Wesley's life is relevant today for Great Awakenings and revivals. And so, guys, I'm excited to talk about the second of our trio in the Great Awakening, George Whitefield.
Me too. In fact, of the three, I probably have a little bit of a favor towards George Whitefield. I can't really tell you why, but something about his ministry really struck me. I think it's his preaching was so powerful, and I can just envision when Whitefield spoke words like that, when he preached in the midst of what I'd call a lifeless, ritualistic religion. It had to have been like rain falling in the desert to people.
That's a good image, and I think his ministry, as it swept across the British Empire and then the United States, he left an indelible mark on what one would call heart religion,
right?
To where it had transcended from just some academic understanding to a real heartfelt religion, and what a wonderful thing to happen.
If you haven't listened to the first episode on John Wesley, one of my takeaways from that, Cliff, was when you talk about he for me. That personal aspect of the gospel is the story of the Great Awakening. And the reason I think it's a relevant thing for us today is you have to remember the Great Awakening wasn't an evangelistic crusade that began outside the church. It was something that began with churched people, people that knew about God, but they didn't have that knowledge of God, that he died for me. This is all personal. And what we'll talk about in week 3 is Edwards, the great theologian and chronicler of the Great Awakening, talks about the difference between a knowledge of something or a sense of something, an understanding, versus the felt experience of something. So to say that honey is sweet versus to taste it in your mouth, that's the difference between pre-Great Awakening and post-Great Awakening. And when we think about our world today, that's really what we need, is we need people to have an encounter with the living God. Not just, oh, this is, what my parents believed or grandparents, or this is American Christianity. This is who God is. This is who I know him to be. This is who I've experienced him to be. And you could go throughout all of history and find very few people that had a bigger impact than George Whitefield. And I mean, I just want to spend a minute here talking about it because it's almost hard to believe when you talk about the numbers and the years that he put in and the popularity that he was able to see on both sides of the Atlantic, in England and in America. There have been very few people that have had the ministry that George Whitefield did.
And he did not serve in easy places. Bristol, which was a very blue-collar, hard-working scrabble, some would call it, and he served there and worked there in terms of that field preaching. He didn't serve in some easy places.
That's true. Thomas Kidd wrote a book called America's Spiritual Founding Father. And I know George Whitefield, and that struck me when I saw it, because I really don't think about George Whitefield that way. I think about him as being British, but then you realize he was in America 7 different times and had a huge impact here. But I really never thought about this. This is what Kidd says about him. He said, Whitefield was the first internationally famous itinerant preacher and the first modern transatlantic celebrity of any kind. And so for someone who's not particularly well known in evangelical circles in America, he was sort of a transatlantic phenomenon in the 1700s.
If you think Billy Graham in America and across the world, that's the kind of person we're talking about. I mean, everywhere he goes, when you read his journals, preached to 7,000, then had dinner, then 10,000 gathered in a field, then was at the house and 700 people showed up for prayer. And it's not just about the numbers, it's that this wave was sweeping over the world, and he was preaching and preaching and preaching and preaching and seeing people come to this real encounter with Jesus Christ. It's almost hard to wrap your mind around.
And one of the things that happened in England was he got people to support him. One of the great leaders of Lady Huntington, who helped finance preaching houses in places. I mean, they were in the fields, but as things began to grow, she began to support them, and Wesley and Whitefield. But she was a strong supporter of George Whitefield, that his ministry should increase. And in Bath, Bristol, and other places like that, she helped finance places for him to serve and to be involved. So she was a great leader. And of course, that was pretty unusual in 18th century England to have a lady who is with the resources and ability she had to support his ministry.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about England before Whitefield, because it's easy to look back and think of Christendom and the great rich Christian history of England. This was not the high point of Christianity in England. In fact, this is one of the low points in history. You had a church that was very ossified. You had bishops and people in the Church of England that really didn't know God. They were more in it for the position and the prestige and the status. In fact, J.C. Ryle has this great book, Cliff, that you told me about, and he's describing the spiritual state of England, and he is talking about these Anglican bishops and how worldly they were. In fact, there's two things that popped out to me when I read this. The first one is, he says, in order to stop Whitefield's ministry, the bishops actually discussed among themselves whether the best thing might be to make him a bishop, as that would rein him in for what he was doing.
I remember that.
But this quote got me. He said, "These Anglican bishops determined to know everything except Jesus Christ and him crucified. When they did preach, their sermons were so unspeakably and indescribably bad that the only comfort is knowing that they were usually preached to empty pews."
That's scathing.
Yeah. So he points out all the good things that you think of in evangelical Christianity in England and in America were not there. The mission movements had not arisen yet. Christian schools, training institutes, a lot of vibrant churches, Christian literature, none of this existed. So in one sense, you had this dry ground that was ready for the rain to come, as we spoke about earlier. But at the same time, this was swimming very upstream for someone like George Whitefield, John and Charles Wesley, in America, Jonathan Edwards. This was not an easy time. Just because it was in the past doesn't mean it was an easy time to be a Christian.
Well, and one of the great quotes in that section of that time is William Wilberforce, who had been converted under Wesley and Whitefield and all the working. He was so, he made this observation: how could Christian England tolerate chattel slavery the way they did? And it was his lifelong goal to end it, and he finally did just before he died. But he made this observation when he said that England's heart had grown cold because their heads were empty. And what they needed was a strong dose of the peculiar doctrines of Christianity. Wilberforce assessed that this is why the heart had grown cold in England, where there were more ale houses than there were anything else, where chattel slavery was accepted as an acceptable kind of practice. And so here's Whitefield, who decides to address some of those issues. Where does he go? Bristol, which was the actual largest port in England at the time for the transfer of transatlantic slavery. So England was in a terrible condition. And he and others helped change that in a miraculous way.
One of the effects of revival that we talked about is you do see that social change. You see great social upheavals happen. Of course, you see the American Revolution, which this, as we talked about, is kind of the revolution before the revolution, the spiritual revolution. You see there's great spiritual revival before the Civil War in America. There's great revivals in America before the Civil Rights Movement. And so there is this component of change over time that takes place. And we take for granted some of those changes now, but this was a very dark and very pagan time in England. Whitefield comes from humble beginnings, and it's interesting to look throughout history. Sometimes you see somebody who comes from the upper classes, from the nobility. You can see this in the Bible. People like Isaiah, probably a relative of the king. You see Paul was in some elite academic circles of the Pharisees. And then you see people who, if it weren't for God's intervention in their life, we would never have heard of them. George Whitefield is one of those people. Born in 1714, he was from a relatively poor family. They were innkeepers, and he and his mother and his siblings had to work so diligently keeping their inn open that he had to drop out of school and just work with the family until he was convinced that going to Oxford would be the plan for him. And when he was a kid, he was very devout. He wanted to be a preacher. He had written sermons. He would sometimes stay up all night reading the Bible. But that flame almost went out when he left school and had to work until he goes to Oxford. And that's kind of one of the big turning points in his life.
Well, part of his journey, as we know, was that Charles Wesley befriended him and invited him to breakfast one day, which in this highly structured culture, because of his, if you will, common upcoming or whatever, to be invited to eat breakfast with an upperclassman that had a higher social status, that was really breaking a lot of the rules. And Charles really became the friend. And in some of the readings I've read about Whitefield, he is forever thankful for that relationship. And that introduced him to some other serious followers of Jesus. Charles, other friends, that it's my understanding Whitefield made this statement that Charles had put a book in his hands called The Life of God in the Soul of Man by Henry Scourgall. And he made the statement that he had never known religion before he read that book. And so Oxford really was the turning point, and those friendships continued throughout his life.
Yeah, in fact, I remember reading that in 1738, when Whitefield set sail for America, for his first trip to America, it was Charles that saw him off. And he wrote to his brother, John. He said, this man is one on whom God has truly poured out his spirit.
Yeah.
And of course, he was going as a representative of the Holy Club and the Methodists to go to America. And so that relationship, I know it didn't always stay, it was always personally close, didn't always stay theologically close with the Wesleys. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is how they came out of the same soil.
Yeah.
One of the lessons from Whitefield's early life is just the power of friends and mentors. It seems like sometimes in Christian history, you see people that just all of a sudden emerge fully formed, like 100 years later, Charles Spurgeon. He's a 16-year-old phenomenal preacher, and he stays that way for his whole life. But Whitefield was really different. He was constantly learning from people. He was being encouraged by people. He was building these networks of people wherever he went. And later in his life, he talks about when he's in America listening to Gilbert Tennant preach and what an effect his preaching had on him. Here's one of the greatest preachers of Christian history, and he's talking about how great somebody else's sermons were. He writes in his journal that he convinced me more and more that we can preach the gospel of Christ no further than we have experienced the power of it in our own hearts. I found out what a baby and a novice I was in the things of God. It's a very profound thing for somebody like Whitefield to say, but it shows what he owed to these relationships that he had.
Yeah.
You know, we've talked about Tim Keller before, and I just saw a parallel here as I was thinking about this. In the biography of Keller, you realize that, and I was reading it, I didn't realize, oh, he was at this university with this person. And all of a sudden you realize there were connectedness amongst several people who 20 years later would all be publishing and all be doing that. And I wondered if an awakening or a revival builds itself out of some of these relationships, because here we are talking about how he, against the odds, really got connected to John and Charles Wesley, got connected to the Methodist groups and the Holy Club, and some other names will come out later. But it's almost like God put this critical mass of people together and then launches the awakening. I wonder if that's true for every revival.
I think that's a great observation from the standpoint that it's not just a superstar. I mean, Whitefield was a superstar, but he had been formed, like you said, Cole, with these relationships and these experiences that just formed him and continued to form him. He didn't get then rogue and just by himself.
Right.
Even though he and Wesley had some deep theological differences, they really relied on one another in their work together, especially in Bristol and Kingswood. And I think that's a great observation that, one person has said, show me your friends and I'll show you your future.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he had some incredible and continued to have incredible friends.
Well, and on that point, he had frenemies. I mean, he and John Wesley were rivals in their doctrinal systems, not in the cause of the gospel, but in their doctrinal systems, in their opinions. They're both very well-spoken. They're both kind of type A personalities to take what they believe and run with it. But I think maybe a couple of episodes ago, I don't know if you remember this quote that somebody asked George Whitefield if they would see John Wesley in heaven. And, just that somebody would ask that question is kind of eye-opening. But that just tells you how deep some of the rifts were theologically. And Whitefield goes, oh no, we won't see him. He'll be so close to the throne. We'll be so far in the back. And it just gives you a sense of, even in his disputes with someone as great as John Wesley, the humility of understanding that at the end of the day, they're going for the same cause.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting lesson for somebody as popular and as famous as he is, that he showed a lot of deference in his life. He had a true humility in his life, which we'll talk about later, I think maybe why that is in his life. But celebrity, yes, in the sense that he was well known. Influential, yes, but very humble, very tied in with other people. It's a great takeaway from his life. So he's ordained at 22, begins his ministry, preaches his first sermon in Gloucester, and then begins preaching in London, faces a lot of pushback. And it's interesting now to think about why he got a lot of pushback. It was mostly because of what he was preaching about regeneration. And this was very offensive to people that were in this kind of lackadaisical church inertia of, you see this in America in Jonathan Edwards' church, which we'll talk about on the next episode, that his major problems came from people who wanted to be considered Christians, but who would not make a confession of faith.
Right.
And if you start really preaching regeneration by the Holy Spirit, the kind of nominal Christian environment is going to really heat up. And Whitefield faced that. And so because of that and other things, he decides to go to America. And that, as you said earlier, he does this 7 times in his life, which at this point wasn't,
it was not a quick
American Airlines flight.
Not an easy trip.
Months of travel. So he gets invited by the Wesleys to come and to take leadership of this orphanage in Georgia, which is funny when you read his journals. Every time he preaches, I got 40 pounds for the orphans in Georgia. I mean, this was his constant fixation after this, but it was the thing that got him to America that in the big scheme of things was a very small operation compared to what he ended up doing. But this was the ticket to get him to America. Come, take leadership in this orphanage, preach in Georgia, and then really the entire American seaport on the East Coast started to come alive.
Yeah, I remember, Ben Franklin is active at this time, and Ben Franklin urged him to preach to the aristocracy as well in America, the landed gentry, if you will, because he felt like if he could elevate their faith, then that would have an influence on everybody else. And while Franklin himself, there are a lot of questions about how committed he was, but he did say this about the aristocracy. He said, there are numbers who perhaps fear less being in hell than being out of fashion. And so you realize that what's going on in America at that time is also a little bit of a spiritual drought. Now, just skipping ahead, Whitefield died in, I believe, New Hampshire. He was in America when he died in 1770. And now we look at the Declaration of Independence, 1776, and you see this very spiritual, God-oriented language. I think that's a little bit of a reflection of the fruit of Whitefield's work through the 1700s. Is he really was, in some sense, responsible for the spiritual state of the Founding Fathers.
Well, and you think about that time, Whitfield's coming to America and doing incredible work. And then Wesley sends Thomas Cook and Francis Asbury.
Mm.
And so you've got two English, if you will, oriented kind of ministries that are now sweeping the United States and bringing revival here. When Cook and Asbury, they ride their horses all the way to Kentucky and the frontier. And so Whitefield and Wesley are working together again. They worked together in England. Now they're working together here. So they are just God's instruments at that time, I guess, and they're able to find their lane and work together. I'm just fascinated by it, that how God used them both on both continents.
Yeah.
One of the things that we think, when I think about Great Awakening, I think about the Wesleys, I think about Whitefield, I think about they got out of the churches, kind of the lifeless, ritualistic services, and to the common person, to the coal miners and the field workers and that kind of thing. But actually, that, I believe, the first time, correct me if I'm wrong, Cliff, but I think after that first visit to America, when Whitefield went back, maybe 1739, something caused him to not preach in the churches. I think maybe he was being kept out of the churches, and he decided he'd go into the fields. And then was it him that recruited John Wesley to do the same?
Yeah, he had, again, there was this strong parish kind of thing. If you don't have a parish, then you don't have a place to preach. Well, Whitefield saw the need and began to preach, and then people are responding, and the area pastors are just out of their minds over it. He's going to go back to America, so he calls John Wesley to say, "I need somebody to keep this going," and some have said somebody to organize it, because hundreds of people are responding. And so, when he comes back and he and Wesley meet or talk about this, he encourages Wesley to come. And of course, last time we talked about, how Wesley resisted the idea of field preaching, back to that kind of proper English gentry mentality. But so he recruits him because he's got to go back to the United States again to do another preaching tour.
Well, and that highlights the kind of organically. So you get all these people being converted, but they're being converted in the fields and on the work sites, and there's no, quote, church structure to do anything with them.
Right.
And so this is where Whitefield's genius was in preaching this, and Wesley, while he was also an outstanding preacher, but he kind of came in and organized because the church wasn't willing or able to organize these people coming to Christ.
Well, I was doing a blog the other day about this idea that I don't want to be crass here, but Wesley tried to out-organize the devil. He decided, and there is a long history in England or English religious practice of called societies. There was a society for the propagation of the gospel. There was the society for the renewal of manners, which Wilberforce was a part of. And so Wesley's idea was to take that kind of framework of a society. It would be in Bristol or London or Glasgow or wherever, and then organize that group to be a society. Then they'll break that down into a class and then down to a band. And so Wesley did. We used to call that, when I was in school, called conserving the fruit of evangelism, that there was that need because they weren't going to get that going back into the church. They weren't going to get that in the Anglican church of this kind of nurturing.
It's interesting to think about what they were doing in that context as taking the gospel, the same gospel the Puritans were preaching and the Reformers were preaching, but using totally different methods. And in fact, unacceptable methods to some of the established church people to reach people that they otherwise couldn't reach. I really think that the impetus for Whitefield taking the gospel into the fields was that's where the people were that weren't going to be reached.
Right.
And he has this passion to go and preach the gospel to people that need to hear it. And just to give you a sense of what this was like, there's one of his early opportunities to preach in America is in this coal mining town. And he begins preaching, and he says, he didn't have a lot of freedom at first, which we'll come back to this. The way he describes his preaching is really interesting. But he looks out and he sees white troughs beginning to form on the coal miners' faces. He realizes that they're weeping and it's washing the soot off their faces, and he can see that the word is having its impact. And so he begins to preach even more with more freedom and more fervor, and he sees hundreds of people in that town converted. And then, you have to have, if that's your new missionary strategy, your new evangelistic strategy, then the outcome is you've got all these people that then need to be discipled. And so they create, a way to do that. And so there's an enduring lesson on both sides of this. One, that we do need to think innovatively about how to reach people that nobody else is reaching. And then secondly, that you have to do that every time you want to see something new happen. So in Keller's Center Church, he talks about everybody always has the tendency to try to redo the last revival. In history, this is always you fight the last war. Same weapons, same strategies, all of that. But it wasn't the field preaching. Or like it wasn't the tent revivals. Sorry. It wasn't the mode. It was the message. And the message is going to stay the same and the mode is going to change. So you can have the delivery mechanism, which is going to be different, and you need to innovate and you need to reach people in a way that maybe people haven't done before, but you don't change the message. The gospel that you'll hear in Billy Graham and in George Whitefield and in Martin Luther and in Augustine and whoever else, it's the same gospel. Really different methods and means. And every revival has those qualities. Convincing something new, trying to reach people, and then the next one doesn't look anything like it. And it's a very human temptation to try to go back nostalgically to just do what worked last time. But that is to forget that it's really the message, not the method.
I agree with that. If you look at a secular example, we would all agree that the internet and then smartphone access, if you just stop and think for a minute, there's no doubt that has revolutionized our society. So that change in the medium, the access to information, the way we can access one another, social media, etc., that has been a revolutionary medium. It's a medium, though, without any content, without any principle, and consequently, we look around and we say, wow, this medium is very powerful, but look at the devastation it has wrought in loneliness and depression and other things. And so I really take to heart what you're saying. Whatever means we may use may be powerful, but if the means are the power of what you're doing, if it's your performance, if it's whatever, that is going to lead to bad results. It's fundamentally the power of the gospel message and the regeneration of lives. And so we just need to keep the main thing, and not be afraid then to use other media.
Well, I think, too, one of the things we're hitting on around here, at least in my mind and my heart, is that here are two men. We talked about Wesley, Whitefield, we'll talk about Edwards. Here are two people that started with a real sense of need for God. This was not an amateurish kind of, well, it might help me out live my better life or to solve a problem that I have over here with my career. They had a real sense, maybe this is an old way of saying it, but they had a real sense of being under the conviction and judgment of God. When they heard the gospel and understood it, where we can talk a lot about that, how that occurs through the Spirit, but there was a change of heart, an enlivening of their heart, that the good news was something they couldn't stop talking about. So I wonder at times if people nowadays don't have a deep enough sense of need for God, that the gospel or church it's nice to do and it helps you live your better life and those kind of things. But there really isn't any real deep fundamental sense in which I stand before God or need to be in right relationship with Him. Wesley and Whitefield both attributed the idea that they were both men that said, I'm a man on fire, come and watch me burn. There was something that had gotten a hold of them. And I long for that in my own life at times even more. But I just wonder in our culture, in our world, that people are almost anesthetized to their need for God. And if there can be that sense of, wait a minute, this is being in right relationship with God, not just trying to fix your career or your kids or something like that. That these guys, I mean, you read their lives, and there was a real depth of need they sensed, and the gospel became really good news.
Mm-hmm. It goes back. One of the most profound takeaways for me out of this whole thing is what you were talking about, Cole, when Whitefield heard Tennant preach, and that idea, I'll paraphrase it, that you can't preach any more powerfully, you can't take people anywhere. I mean, your technique could be great, but you have no more power than what you've experienced of the power of God in your life. And I think that's a takeaway for all of us as well, is that revival can't start because we have good techniques and great light shows and great use of social media. While all those things are useful, we can't take anybody further than we have experienced it. And that is my takeaway from both Wesley and Whitefield, is they had a very personal knowledge, firsthand knowledge of their need and the power of the gospel in their lives. And I think that's what made them so powerful, even beyond their technique in the pulpit.
Right. There was there was a reality to the new life they were experiencing that they had never known before. And again, they're brought up Anglican. They've been in church. They've been religious, but man, they had an encounter with God.
Yeah, that's what changed each of these lives, and I think that's what leads them to have a ministry where they see this happen. Is they had experienced it, they understand it, and they preach from that.
Yeah,
and boy, Whitefield did preach. I mean, if you look at the numbers of his life, he's going back and forth. He's in Scotland, he's in Wales, he's in England, he's in America. He's active in ministry for about 34 years. Preaches 18,000 times, which is more than 10 times a week. More than 10 times a week for 34 years. He, on Sundays, would do Sunday morning service and then prayers, 3 sermons later, pastoral care. He'd teach every day of the week. I mean, he was a maniac going and preaching these sermons, but it was because something in him was compelling him to preach these sermons. That doesn't leave a lot of time for sermon prep. This was not just well-crafted messages.
Right.
These were messages from the heart. And that kind of brings me to, at the end of his life, he dies in 1770, as we mentioned. Kind of suddenly, he's been kind of sick, but kind of suddenly dies. He preaches the last sermon before he dies the night before on 2 Corinthians 13:5. Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith, which is just a great Whitefield text to preach. What do you think it was that made Whitefield so unique, so special? What was it in him as a preacher, as a person in the time period that he lived, that made him so impactful? It's like I said, this isn't just somebody that had a great ministry and very faithful. I mean, there's a lot of those throughout history. There are very few Whitefields and Wesleys and Edwards. What was it? What made him so unique?
Well, I'll start with the least spiritual thing, and there are more, but if you think about it, when you were reading excerpts from his journal, he literally, I mean, we stop and think about mega churches, and you think about, there's, 10,000 people, 20,000 people. He really would just write matter-of-factly, preach today to 20,000 people. And then 7,000 tomorrow. And it was raining, so we only had 10,000. I mean, but it's just matter-of-fact to him. But stop and think about this for a minute. He's preaching in a field. How in the world can you hear a guy? 20,000 people can hear him. And so I was reading about Benjamin Franklin. When he was in America, same thing happened. He's just preaching. In fact, when he went to Scotland, they had to quit announcing when and where he preached because they got too many people. So he comes to America, and Franklin does a little experiment. There's people crowded around, shoulder to shoulder, all around him. And Franklin decides he's going to walk away and see, how far can I go and still hear him? So he goes 500 feet away. He said, back toward his office, he said, when I got about 500 feet away, I could no longer make out what he was saying. That's unbelievable. He said, and then I turned around and looked, and I thought, how many people could get within the sound of my voice? And he estimated, this is Benjamin Franklin, estimating about 50,000 people could probably hear him. And so this is not a very spiritual thing, but God clearly gifted him with a voice.
Right.
You bet.
Right. You bet. That's kind of a funny thing, because if you read Spurgeon's lectures to my students, he talks about this. He says, shallow-chested men should not be preachers. You got to have a voice. You got to have, this is before microphones and everything.
Right.
There are some just logistical things that you think about with people like this that there were keys. His voice, it wasn't just loud. You hear people talk about listening to him preach. His voice was apparently so melodic and wonderful to listen to that had a big deal. I think somebody said he could make people cry just by pronouncing the word Mesopotamia. And that is something that in an oral culture, that makes a big difference. Think about his physical constitution. That's another thing. I think about this with the Apostle Paul. Of course, John Wesley is the perfect example of this.
Right.
When you read his journals, he is coming home at night, collapsing, throwing up, can't sleep. I mean, he is in physical agony. And he'll write things like, but was able to get some sleep, and the Lord sustained me in the morning. Gathered at Gloucester, preached to 10,000. I mean, it's the same thing over and over again.
Right.
His physical constitution, the fact that he didn't die on any of these voyages across the Atlantic is a big deal. There are certain providences of God that don't look all that providential. They look more happenstance. Well, he was lucky he didn't. He went on the wrong ship at the wrong time. He's lucky he had a loud voice. All of these things God used to contribute to his ministry.
But, you'd have to say, Cliff, I don't know, moving up the spiritual chain a little bit, what you just said was what he was doing wasn't easy. It wasn't like you go to a concert and you see a performer and they've got all these people in the green room and they're ushered out and taken care of and they go out and they do their thing and off they go, get in the limo, etc. And that's amazing. Their talent is great. But he did everything he did through great difficulties and suffering. And so you said it's his constitution, and I agree with that. It's also some burning fire in him that was able to overcome those.
Well, when I read he and many others of that era, they would often use the idea of lively faith, not just faith, but lively, that it had been ignited. Something, whether this is common or whether it's something God uniquely did for him, there was a encounter. What makes me wonder, how did he even sustain that with the pace he kept?
Right.
But there was an encounter with God. There was a sense in which he had an experience. Wesley said that when he preached, he lived by preaching. So something's going on here. That God has, I think, uniquely picked these men. When Wesley said, I live by preaching, I think Whitefield lived by preaching. Something was happening uniquely, which, again, I don't know how to identify it. But in my way of thinking about it, I would say to students when I worked at the university about what we all needed, I'd say is we need a real encounter with a real Jesus. We need a real encounter with a real Jesus. And whatever, somehow that happened, that happened to George Whitefield. And I go back to that book that I've read time after time. When I read it, it puts me on my knees. The Life of God and the Soul of Man. Scoregall's work. I mean, that work by itself will just put you on your knees. And Whitefield said, this is the one that brought me to Christ. So it has to be something here that they're experiencing, that they've known. And again, I would think that that's available to all of us. These guys really, this is a little bit sidebar, but these guys make me question all the time, okay, Cliff, how can you be used by God? How can you be involved in the work of God with a culture that is as messed up as England was, that is as secularized as England was? So they're disturbing to me, both of them, and not just Wesley and Whitefield, Cynic, Howell, Roland, Venn, all these guys. They all make me nervous.
That's the truth, and you see this maybe most strikingly in his prayer life. He's a famous preacher, but his prayer life, it has an intensity to it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a dependence. There's an encounter in his prayer life. If you read Jack Miller's book, Outgrowing the Ingrown Church, he looks at the history of revivals and renewals and talks about that in every revival, you'll find prevailing prayer preceding it. people that feel that God is calling them especially to pray sacrificially for what he might do, and then you see revival happen. So you get these groups of people that are praying, not even knowing exactly what they're asking God to do other than to bring revival and renewal. And that's the way that God almost whets the spiritual appetite for what's going to come. And that certainly happened in America with Whitefield. Is these people were already praying. Revival was already starting regionally. These pastors in these churches were preaching in ways that were really different than they had before. And then Whitefield gets there and it just catches fire. And so that's one of the components. Whitefield was a man of tremendous prayer.
Yeah. I said before that, I think that in America, we think that when we pray, we're not doing anything. And, it makes me question all the time to say, have we just relegated prayer to some little thing here? Or is it that real sense of which I think of Paul when he says that, isn't it Epaphroditus? He is agonizing, agonizomai. He's agonizing for you in prayer. And I think, whoa, what was the last time that happened with me?
Right.
This sense of bearing and praying and believing. And so there has to be some of that. Because Whitefield, as you said accurately, is a man of prayer.
And tied with that, there's no way to explain his ministry without the power of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
Right. He was capable of doing some things that we would all point to and say, well, that's going to work. That's going to preach. That's really good. But nobody is capable of doing what he was able to do without the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
Right.
And I'll go back to this point we mentioned earlier. When you read him talking about his preaching, this becomes very evident. So I wrote down a couple of quotes. He says at one point, I began to preach at first, not with much freedom, but at last the word ran and melted many down. Or he says, after I'd begun, the Spirit of the Lord gave me freedom till at last he came down like a mighty rushing wind and carried all before it. Let's get this sense that he's preaching for a while, getting loosened up.
His picture in the pulpit,
he's able to really start to preach after he's done this for a little bit. But there's a power of the Spirit that he was conscious of while he was preaching.
Yeah.
And he'll say, preach to 6,000 without much result. The Spirit wasn't there.
Yeah.
And then you'll have him even doing private devotions in homes of families that are hosting him. And he'll say, and as I prayed and as we talked, the Spirit came and people groaned and wept over what God was doing. This is just like in a family home.
Right.
He's doing. Because to him, it didn't matter. It didn't really matter if it was the Spirit showing up in the field with 20,000 people or the Spirit showing up when somebody comes over to where he's staying afterwards and needs prayer into the wee hours of the morning. He wants to see the Spirit do the Spirit's work. And he, maybe more than some of the others in the Great Awakening, it is a great example of a living picture of walking by the Spirit.
Yeah.
He is somebody we would consider today very charismatic in the sense that he knew when he preached that it would be a display of the Spirit and of power in his preaching. It's very dramatic. He would weep. He would yell. He would do all these things, but it was all because the Spirit was working through him. I don't think you can explain his ministry without that.
I agree. There's a sense in which we think, and this is a takeaway for me, is that when an awakening comes, God moves, that's true, through his Spirit, and that's certainly true, but that he anoints a particular person, and that is the reason for the awakening. Well, there's no doubt that there's some truth in that, but I have to stop for a minute and ask myself this. Is it possible that any one of us who had the real encounter with the real Christ and ignited the Spirit within us, can you imagine what God could do with each of us? And so I'm not saying that each of us could be a Whitefield. That's in God's choosing and God's orchestrating. But let's not stop there and say, well, God, please raise up a George Whitefield. It's like, God, ignite the Spirit in me, because I think that's what God can use. He may also bring us a Wesley or a Whitefield for our time. But imagine what he can do if each of us had that. So I take less of a God, I want you to act, but it's like, perhaps I should start with my own, make me like George Whitefield, having that learning and that encounter.
Right. Yeah, there's a quote here that I think is a great summary of his impact and the impact that we take from him for our own life and for our own world. He's praying with this group of clergy, and afterwards one of these ministers writes down, "I have been a scholar and have preached the doctrines of grace for a long time. But until then, I believe I had never felt the power of them in my own soul." That's the outcome. That is renewal. Not that we would become Whitefields, like you said, but that we would have the encounter, that we would live from that encounter, that other people would feel them to be true in their own soul.
And that is the mysterious work of the Spirit, to take what one might know and what might speak and understand and make it substantively real.
Right.
And I think, again, we've talked about this, that it's not technique. It's not, we do the best we can. When I teach, I always pray I want to be creative in presentation, but I want to be faithful to the text. But this understanding of the Spirit's making it real to a person's life and soul, I don't know that we have thought through at times how dependent we are on God's Spirit. Like you said, Terry, what do you want to do with me? How do you want me to be participating in this? Because these leaders, others, there was that real sense of, I've preached it, I've talked about it, I've said it, but man, it's real now. And that seems to be part of the genius of it.
As a cliffhanger for the third episode, Martin Lloyd-Jones has a book on the Puritans. He writes about Whitefield. He writes about many of these famous people, but he includes Jonathan Edwards in the end.
Oh, yeah.
And he talks about the preaching of Jonathan Edwards, and he says, Edwards, maybe more than anyone else, knew that you didn't just need to preach so that things were clear, or even that things were true, but that these words of God live.
Yeah.
It's the goal of preaching.
Yeah.
We'll talk about him the next time on the So We Speak podcast.